Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. This episode, I'm actually going to see if I can find the last significant rock album in the history of rock music. Now, rock music has ceased to possess the cultural dominance that it had in the past. And the question is, when did that happen? I don't know if I'm exactly going to get that answer, but in this episode we're going to look back at what I think the last album is that had a sizable cultural influence. Now, you may agree or disagree with my conclusion, and I hope this starts a conversation. I guess what I'm looking for here is an album that was very innovative musically. And, it changed the direction of rock music, but was also a mass seller, meaning many people bought it, many people knew about it, many people listened to it. Now, of course, if we're talking in rock history, an album that would exemplify this kind of idea would, of course, be Nirvana's Nevermind. When the album was released in 1991, not only did it become massively successful, it completely changed rock music and upended the expectations of the previous decade. Now, I would actually argue that no rock album since then has had that same kind of impact. But there certainly were significant albums in the wake of Nirvana. Now, clearly, by the 2010s, rock was no longer a significant cultural force. In fact, rock is the sort of force that gives us meaning. Really started the decline after the death of Kurt Cobain. So I guess we're going to look at what was the last album to have a huge impact on a cultural level. So we're going to look at some albums after Nirvana through the 90s. I'm going to talk about the millennium a little bit. And again, I'm looking for an album that was both innovative or a game changer in terms of rock's progression, but was also successful in terms of reaching the masses. So let's look at a few albums here. Now, of course, right after Kurt Cobain's passing, the pop-punk bands really came into the forefront. So let's look first at Green Day's Dookie. This album came out during the aftermath of Kurt Cobain's death. Arguably, this album was a game changer in terms of sound. I would argue not in a good way, but that's just my opinion. But Green Day took the pop-punk sounds of Southern California, which had been around for at least 10 years prior to the release of this album, and I was always surprised that some of these bands from that time, like All or Bad Religion, were not more popular on a mainstream level, because pop punk is really quite a palatable sound. The emphasis is on the pop. Now, the thing is with Green Day is, in the wake of the sort of grunge sound, what you have here is a rock that's really cleaned up. Again, you can sing along to the choruses, and it's very palatable. Green Day also brought in this sort of immature youth culture that would continue to sort of blanket everything, especially by the end of the late 90s. Now, while this album was significant, it was really, in my opinion, a step in the wrong direction, and I do kind of like Green Day, but I don't really like what this started. Now, of course, we got to talk about Smashing Pumpkins' Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, released in 1995. Yeah, this album was more of a refinement of the teen angst that the grunge bands had brought to the masses with a more sort of diversified sound. Billy Corgan mastered that quiet, loud dynamics that Kurt Cobain had gotten from the Pixies. Now, this double album combines everything from, kind of the grunge sound, more general alternative rock. But you got strings, you got samples, and even got some metal in there, and noise. Corgan's whiny voice exemplifies a sort of teen angst, and in many ways, he kind of created the essential teen album here. Now, the highlight of the album is the track 1979, where the band uses loops and samples to create a futuristic sound. So, this is definitely an album that had a lot of impact. Again, it was very much how to market teen angst to the public. refining that Nirvana sound, again, making it more sort of a palatable thing. Now, another album that was quite popular in the mid-90s was, of course, Oasis, What's the Story, Morning Glory. And so here we're going over to the UK. And this album brings Britpop, exemplified by bands like Blur and Verve and Lush. It brought it to the masses. So it's released in 1995, and I guess the difference here is you got kind of these working class lads, and they're kind of creating a version of kind of muscular Beatlesque pop. Was this original? No, not really. It certainly rocked. And one thing that was likable about it is it did seem a little bit less pretentious than some of the other Britpop bands. But musically innovative, not really. Now, the band would never really reach this depth again. They had several hits from the album. And, there were these great sing-along things, kind of like a soccer chant, I guess, in some ways, You don't have to really think too much. But, I guess after some of the sort of teen angst and darkness of grunge, people were wanting kind of something a bit simpler, less pretentious. But yeah, huge cultural impact, maybe. Now another album. Again, I'm talking about albums that reach the masses here, so don't get mad at me that I'm not including all these great indie and underground albums of the 90s, okay? The other album is Marilyn Manson's Antichrist Superstar. It captured the public's imagination. Now, what Marilyn Manson does here is it's like an homage or a satire of the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar. Manson, he'd taken the ideas of these, visual shock rockers, people like Alice Cooper, Kiss, and also David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust. And he put a kind of further image. He fused those things and made it much more ugly visually. And it really matched the kind of postmodern darkness of the 90s. Now, what the band did here was they're taking musical and conceptual elements from extreme metal. I'm talking like, the death metal and stuff like that. Industrial music and goth rock, and sort of packaging all that together to a viewership or a listenership that would be the kids in the suburban mall. So you're taking all those things that very much permeated the underground and you're pushing it into the mainstream. Now, suburban parents probably watching the disturbing images in the videos for The Beautiful People or Sweet Dreams, that was their cover of the Eurythmics song, must have imagined that their teenage children would be led astray by this mutant-looking Pied Piper. Now, I'm not really innovative, this band, musically. They're just kind of injecting more metal into the Trent Reznor sound. But it certainly created a lot of goth children in its wake, and definitely had a big visual influence. Okay. I'm going to argue this is the last significant rock album on a cultural level. Disagree with me if you want in the comments, please. But the next album is definitely this. It is definitely the last innovative rock album. And of course, I'm referring to Radiohead's 1997 masterpiece, OK Computer. Radiohead's very interesting because they did have two previous albums which were successful, that did have hits, but they really took a turn here for experimentation, and it really worked out for them. Now, they're taking inspiration from all kinds of things. Sort of the sparse sounds on Miles Davis' Bitches Brew album, an incredible album and a pioneer album of jazz fusion. They take a lot of influence from the German band Can. And they're also inspired sort of those layered recording techniques first pioneered by the Beatles. Now, what the band had done here is they create a rock-oriented album that was layered with electronics throughout the recording. The melody throughout it's shimmering at times, it's jagged at times. The whole thing is philosophical, it's definitely melancholy throughout, and the album kind of captures the landscape of a post-industrial Britain immersed in mindless consumer capitalism. I mean, the sound engineering here is absolutely incredible. Again, you got electronic sounds that are layered with acoustic guitar and the rest of a fierce rock band. and along with the kind of twisted and haunting voice of Tom York. I mean, while the band is referencing sounds from the past, it is put together in a completely unique way. And the album makes very deep commentary, again, on the kind of corporate capture of culture and the lack of meaning in a technologically obsessed consumer society. I mean, it's very relevant today. And, you know, like Pink Floyd's epic albums from the 70s, like Dark Side of the Moon, this album has to be listened to in its entirety. Now, even though the record company thought this was like, you know, commercial suicide, the album sold well, and by September 2000, it sold 4.5 million copies worldwide. And what's interesting is Radiohead would actually continue in the experimental direction on the next few albums. But again, this sells well, and it's incredibly musically innovative. So I'm going to say that this is the last major rock album that really captured the public's imagination. Okay, now, I know there was a lot of rock music created after this album, but honestly, I don't see the impact of these band artists as being significant on a cultural level or creating that kind of musical innovation that says this is the new wave of music. For me, nu metal basically created a more thicker, palatable version of what Rage Against the Machine was doing. It's very corporate in sound. And the sound of the band's using like Pro Tools and Auto-Tunes, it cleans up the sound. And this happens throughout rock music. The edge is taken out by the compressors and the cleaning up of the sound. In fact, I see two big things happening in Millennium. A big cleaning up of the rock sound with big production. You know, I'm thinking of everything from, you know, Jimmy Eats World to Maroon 5 to Imagine Dragons. I mean, is that even rock music anymore? I really don't think so. Then there is this desire to breathe life back into genres from the past. So I'm going to be sacrilegious here. I'm thinking of the garage rock revival of the White Stripes or the Hives. I mean, I like this music, but this is retro music, not innovative music. This is very much retro music. And I know I will make enemies with that statement. And then there's things like the post-punk revival with bands like Franz Ferdinand. I mean, again, they're just trying to revive the past. And then, you know, the band that took all this inspiration from the original 1975 era punk bands from CBGBs. Of course, I'm talking about the Strokes. They have an album titled, Is This It? And that basically summed up my feelings when I first heard the Strokes and everyone was hyping them around me. Again, none of these bands or music matches what was done on OK Computer by Radiohead. Okay? Now, I'm very well aware that many people will disagree with my conclusion. Please put your ideas in the comments section. Like, tell me what you think the last major rock album was that had a huge cultural impact. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. Please, I'm willing to listen to your voices. Now, in the next video, I might do something exploring the 80s and how the 80s ruined music. More specifically, how the 80s really ruined rock music. Thank you for listening to 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, subscribe, and of course comment. I'm sure there's a lot you can comment on here. Thank you.